Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open one of those eras of American history that's equal parts grit, survival, and sheer stubbornness. You're stepping into the worn boots of a hobo during the Great Depression. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. No shade, most people wouldn't. But that's what makes this ride interesting. Before we jump onto that rattling boxcar, do me a quick favour, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know down in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love picturing you all scattered across the map, each with your own little glow of light in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wooden slats of the boxcar floor vibrate beneath your legs. The train lurches forward, groaning like an old beast, and you grip the cold iron edge of the door just to stay upright. The landscape blurs by. Brown fields, skeletal trees, shacks leaning into the wind. The year is 1932, and the Great Depression has wiped out more than just bank accounts. It's chewed up lives, pride, and the sense of certainty that yesterday's paycheck meant tomorrow's dinner. Now you're here, part of a hidden army of travellers who crisscross America not by choice, but by necessity. This is your initiation into the life of a hobo. Not quite the same as tramp or bum, mind you. A tramp supposedly avoids work whenever possible. A bum? He doesn't even move. But a hobo? That's a worker on the road, somebody who trades sweat for stew. It's not glamorous, but it carries a strange sense of dignity, like being the underdog who refuses to roll over. You feel it in your bones already. You're poor, but you're moving, and moving means you still matter. Your first night out, hunger gnaws like an animal in your gut. The last crust of bread you carried is long gone, and the only thing sharper than the cold wind is the ache of emptiness in your stomach. That's when you notice the others. Two men crouch near the opposite door of the car. They've tied their bedrolls tight, patched and stained from countless nights of dust and rain. One of them grins, missing teeth but not charm, and tips his hat in your direction. Without speaking, he digs into his coat pocket and tosses you something. It's a shriveled apple, bruised and soft, but to you it looks like treasure. You bite into it, and suddenly you're part of something larger, the unspoken fraternity of the road. Here's a historical fact to ground this scene. During the peak years of the Depression, it's estimated that over 250,000 teenagers took to the rails as hobos. Some were runaways, some were cast out by desperate families, others were chasing that mythical job just one town over. Whole generations carved their survival into the wooden ribs of freight cars. You're not alone out here, never truly. There are always others, just a few boxcars away, sharing the same hunger and hope. But here's the quirky side of it. Hobos weren't just wandering in chaos. They built a language. Almost like wizards leaving tales behind. A swirl of chalk on a fence post, a tiny symbol carved into a gatepost. These were the Hobo Code. A circle with two diagonal lines. That meant get out quick, unfriendly town. A simple cat drawing. A kind lady lives here. Imagine that. A secret map drawn across America, visible only to those desperate enough to understand it. You'll soon start spotting them everywhere, like breadcrumbs left by invisible hands. Still, scholars debate whether hobos were victims or adventurers. On one side you could argue they embodied resilience and freedom, the last romantics of the rails, living outside society's rules. On the other hand, it's easy to see them as people ground down so far they had no choice but to chase scraps of survival wherever they could. Was this lifestyle a badge of honour, or just evidence of desperation? You'll find yourself walking the line between both ideas as your journey unfolds. The train rattles into nightfall. Stars blink overhead, but the blackness feels endless. You lean your head back and listen. Iron wheels on steel rails singing a rhythm that's half lullaby, half billboard warning. The other two men strike up a quiet conversation, swapping tales of towns where work still trickles in, picking fruit in California, canning in Oregon, lumber in Michigan. To you, it sounds less like gossip and more like a treasure map, each place a pin of possibility in your imagination. You'll chase those rumours, even if half of them turn out to be smoke. Sleep doesn't come easy. The boxcar floor is as forgiving as concrete, and every bump knocks your bones together. But eventually your eyes grow heavy, and you dream not of luxury, but of the simple miracle of stew simmering in a tin pot, the smell of onions, the promise of warmth. Out here, even your dreams adapt to survival. When dawn breaks, frost has settled across your blanket. The men are already gone, slipped out at some station stop while you dozed. You're alone again, but somehow less lonely than before. You've tasted the road, shared a bite of an apple with strangers, and discovered that even with nothing in your pockets you can carry forward. The rails stretch out endlessly ahead, a silver thread pulling you deeper into the story of survival. The first lesson you learn out here isn't about food or shelter, it's about signs. Not the cosmic kind, but the ones scratched into fence posts and painted onto back doors with whatever chalk or coal stub a hobo had on hand. You trudge along a dirt road on the edge of a small town, nerves buzzing like static. Every front porch looks like it could hide either kindness or a shotgun. Then you spot it. A simple X with a looping swirl drawn near the gate. You've just stumbled upon the Hobo Code. A survival system so clever it feels like an underground internet made of chalk and whispers. The code is meant to be subtle, invisible to the uninitiated. A circle with an arrow pointing left. Don't linger here, the police are watching. A triangle with 2 dots inside, you'll be met with suspicion. But then there are the good marks. A cat shape for a kind-hearted woman, a cross for a religious household, more likely to hand out bread than curses. Some hobos became so skilled at reading these symbols they could walk through a town like deciphering a secret diary. You're learning fast. Your survival depends on it. You duck behind a hedge to study another chalk mark, and here's a curious historical fact. In 1889, long before the Depression swelled their ranks, hobos held their first National Hobo Convention in Britt, Iowa. Believe it or not, that tradition still carries on today with parades, speeches, even the crowning of a king of the hobos. Imagine that, an entire subculture, marginalised and despised in its time, still celebrated with a sense of pride decades later. It proves hobos weren't just drifters, they were a nation within a nation. Now for a quirky twist, not every symbol was about danger or food. Some marks warned you about dogs with bad tempers, or indicated a free water pump nearby. One even meant safe place to camp. And you, stumbling into a yard with that mark, could suddenly find yourself welcomed with a spot by the barn and a chance to stretch out under a real roof. It's like discovering cheat codes hidden in plain sight. You wonder if anyone in town even notices these tiny hieroglyphs scratched onto their fences. Probably not, which is the beauty of it. Still, scholars go back and forth over how standardised the Hobo Code really was. Was it a shared language across the whole country, or just loose regional slang that shifted depending on who you asked? Some historians argue that the symbols were well organised and widely taught, while others think it was more improvised, the marks varying from camp to camp. In other words, were hobos passing down a system, or just winging it with chalk like an improvised survival graffiti? You're not sure yet, but your life already depends on figuring it out. The road takes you into town where the smells of bacon and coffee leak from kitchen windows. You stop near a gate with that cat symbol scratched low, heart hammering and knock lightly. The door creaks open to reveal an older woman in an apron, hands dusted with flour. She studies you with a look that's part suspicion, part a maternal instinct. Without a word, she vanishes inside and returns with a heel of bread and a small mug of warm milk. You thank her quietly and she nods once before closing the door. That's it. No speeches, no judgment, just survival in its simplest form. Later that night, you find yourself in a hobo jungle on the edge of town. Fires crackle inside tin can stoves and men swap stories under the glow of lantern light. You notice how often they talk about marks, the shorthand of their secret brotherhood. One man swears he saw a drawing of a smiling face once, which meant friendly police, a claim met with jeers and laughter. Another argues that you can tell a town's soul by the chalk marks around it. All bad signs, and you'd better move on. The symbols are more than directions, they're gossip carved into wood, a warning system that speaks louder than words. There's comfort in that code. It reminds you you're not stumbling blind across America. You're part of a lineage of wanderers who figured out how to leave breadcrumbs for each other, not with GPS or maps, but with chalk lines and scratched initials. As you trace the marks with your finger, you feel like you're reading the oldest story in the world. Humans finding a way to communicate, even when they have nothing left but scraps of chalk and the will to survive. You reach the outskirts of the town just as dusk sinks its teeth into the sky. Smoke curls upward from the trees, not chimney smoke, but the low earthy smell of campfires. You've stumbled upon what hobos call a jungle. Don't picture lions or tigers, this jungle is thick as a cluster of makeshift shelters, stitched together from tarps, old quilts, and tin sheets pried off junkyards. It's where the road-worn gather, pooling their scraps and sorrows for a night of uneasy fellowship. A stew pot hangs over the fire, bubbling with whatever got thrown in that day. Beans, potatoes, maybe a scrap of ham if fortune smiled. Your stomach growls loud enough that one of the men chuckles. He hands you a battered tin cup and ladles out a scoop. The broth is watery, but the steam warms your face and the first sip tastes like mercy itself. You realise quickly that food in the jungle isn't just calories. It's currency, it's hospitality. It's proof that even in the leanest times, humans still carve out little islands of generosity. Here's the solid historical detail. Hobo jungles weren't random. They popped up along rail lines, often just outside towns where freight trains slowed enough for a quick hop-off. Some jungles were temporary, gone as soon as the weather turned, while others became semi-permanent, complete with fire pits, communal tools, and regular residents. Imagine that. An entire shadow city hidden in the woods, operating on barter, rumour and trust. Now for the quirky side, some jungles even had designated chefs. These were hobos who earned respect for being able to turn 3 onions and a carrot into something halfway edible. One old-timer might boast of seasoning with wild herbs gathered from the roadside, while another swore by tossing in coffee grounds to stretch the flavour. You raise your eyebrows at the idea until someone offers you a sip. Bitter, yes, but weirdly rich, like survival has its own taste buds. But scholars debate whether these jungles represented community or simply necessity. Were they true villages, where men looked out for each other, or just pit stops where every man ultimately fended for himself? Some argue that the bonds formed in these fireside gatherings were the closest thing to family many hobos ever had. Others claim that theft, fights, and suspicion ran just as rampant, making community more of a fragile illusion. Watching the firelight flicker across faces, you wonder which version is truer or if both coexist in the same smoky air. A man beside you strums a battered guitar, the strings buzzing out of tune but soulful. The song is slow, mournful, and yet you catch laughter breaking through as he tosses in a ridiculous verse about eating canned beans until you grow whiskers. Music weaves the camp together, softening the edges of hunger and despair. You realise that in these moments, the jungle feels less like exile and more like resistance. A small, defiant pocket of people refusing to vanish quietly. Children appear too. Yes, whole families sometimes drifted into jungles. You spot a boy about 10 years old chasing sparks with a stick while his mother stirs the stew, her face gaunt but determined. It's a reminder. Hobos weren't just the stereotypical scruffy bachelors with bindles over their shoulders. They were widows, orphans, veterans, whole families displaced by banks and dust storms. The word hobo becomes less of a caricature and more of a net catching all who fell. The night deepens, and the stories begin. One man swears he rode a boxcar all the way from Georgia to Montana without once touching the ground. Another spins a tale about dodging a railway bull so cunningly the officer tipped his hat in admiration. You can tell half these yarns are stretched thinner than the soup, but no one minds. The storytelling is as nourishing as the stew, filling a hunger that food alone can't touch. You lie back near the fire, the dirt hard beneath your blanket, and watch embers spiral upward like tiny lanterns. In the distance, the faint whistle of a train reminds you the road still calls, that tomorrow you'll shoulder your bundle and move again. But for tonight, here in the glow of a jungle fire, you're not alone. You're part of something ragged, fragile, and strangely beautiful. A society stitched together from nothing but need and stubborn humanity. By the time the sun stretches its pale fingers across the fields, the jungle has already begun to scatter. Fires die down to ashes, men roll their bedrolls into neat cylinders, and the stew pot is scraped clean. You sling your own bundle over your shoulder and fall into step with a small group heading toward the farms outside town. Survival tonight will depend not on stew or chalk marks, but on whether you can trade your hands for food. Work is the closest thing to currency you carry. You arrive at a farm where rows of corn sway in the breeze, stalks tall and proud despite the economic chaos gripping the country. The farmer eyes you and your companions from the porch, arms crossed. His face is carved by both sun and suspicion. This is the moment of truth. Will he see you as a worker or a vagrant? You keep your eyes steady, your posture straight. Finally, he jerks his chin toward the field. Hoe those rows, and there'll be supper, he mutters. That's it. The contract's sealed without paper, ink, or dollar bills. Here's a historical anchor. During the Great Depression, Thousands of hobos earned meals or temporary shelter through what was called work for food. Jobs ranged from chopping wood to harvesting crops to scrubbing barns. It wasn't steady employment and rarely paid as money, but it kept bellies from collapsing in on themselves. Many farmers, themselves struggling to make ends meet, preferred a few hours of labour in exchange for food rather than turning men away entirely. Now for the quirky fact, some hobos became known as professors of odd jobs, skilled at everything from sharpening knives to fixing clocks. If you happened to have a knack for mending fences or playing a fiddle, you might score more generous treatment. There are stories of hobos painting entire barns with brushes cobbled together from horsehair, or crafting toys for farm kids out of scrapwood. You realise quickly that every skill, no matter how strange, has a chance of feeding you. Yet historians debate whether this exchange was fair or exploitative. On one hand, hobos gained food and a brief sense of dignity from honest labour. On the other hand, many were underpaid, or rather, not paid at all, sweating through hours of backbreaking work for nothing more than a crust of bread and a place in the barn hayloft. Was this generosity from farmers, or a clever way of wringing labour from the desperate? As you swing the hoe through stubborn soil, your aching arms lean toward the latter. By dusk, your shirt clings to your back, damp with sweat. Your hands blister, but the farmer's wife sets out supper on the porch. Cornbread, beans, a sliver of ham. You eat slowly, savouring each bite like it's a feast fit for kings. The children stare at you curiously from behind the screen door, whispering to each other as if trying to puzzle out why grown men have to beg for work just to eat. You swallow the last crumb with a lump in your throat, and realising the answer is more complicated than they'll ever want to hear. After supper, you're offered the barn loft. The hay scratches at your skin, but the smell of cut grass and the low snuffles of horses feel almost luxurious compared to the boxcar floor. You watch the moonlight spill through the gaps in the wooden walls and think about how many hobos have lain in this very loft. Staring at the same slice of sky, wondering about tomorrow's meal, the road ties you all together, strangers linked by the rhythm of work, food and movement. Before sleep claims you, you whisper thanks to the farmer under your breath. Not because the system feels fair, but because it's survival. Out here, gratitude isn't about justice, it's about still having the strength to walk away in the morning. And when the rooster calls you awake, the rails are waiting again, stretching toward another town, another porch, another chance to prove that your hands can still buy you bread without a single dollar in your pocket. Your next stop isn't a farm, but the quiet neighbourhood of a small town tucked along the tracks. By now, you've learnt that hunger doesn't give you the luxury of pride. Begging isn't about theatrics, it's about reading people. Watching for a flicker of kindness in their eyes before you even knock on the door. There's an art to it, subtle and strange, and if you get it wrong you could end up with nothing, or worse, a sheriff escorting you out of town. You stand at the edge of a dirt road lined with whitewashed houses, your stomach rumbling loud enough to make you self-conscious. Which door will it be? The Hobo Code helps. There's a faint chalk mark on a gate shaped like a cat. That symbol whispers, "A kind woman lives here." You smooth your hair, straighten your patched shirt, and practice a smile that says honest, hungry and harmless. Knuckles against wood, your heart thuds like a hammer. Here's a fact to keep you grounded. Many hobos learn to follow an unwritten etiquette when begging. The rule was to always ask politely, offer to work in exchange, and never overstay your welcome. Hobos even coined the term bumming a meal, which became part of American slang. Those who were rude or greedy risked spoiling it for everyone else, since towns grew wary quickly if too many wanderers abused generosity. Now the quirky side, hobos passed around tips like trade secrets. They claimed widows were more generous than married couples, or that knocking right at around supper time made your chances better. One tale insists you should always pet the family dog if invited in, it shows you're trustworthy. Some even carried their battered Bible, not for devotion, but because quoting a verse or two might open more doors. You realise this is more performance than pleading, it's a craft, and the stakes are as high as life itself. Scholars argue, though, about the psychology behind these interactions. Was the act of begging merely about food, or did it reveal deeper dynamics of shame, power, and charity during the Depression? Some historians suggest that household generosity toward hobos reflected a shared understanding. There but for fortune go I. Others believe it exposed resentment, as struggling families resented being asked to feed outsiders when they themselves had little. Standing on a stranger's porch, you feel that tension buzzing in the air, invisible but sharp as a knife. The door creaks open. A woman in her 50s, apron dusted with flour, peers at you. You tip your hat and clear your throat, offering to chop wood or sweep the yard in exchange for a bite to eat. Her eyes narrow, then soften. She doesn't ask for work this time, just hands you a plate with a biscuit and a thin slice of ham. You thank her, your voice cracking a little. For a moment, you both stand there silently, an unspoken understanding passing between you. She's one bad harvest away from standing where you are now. Not every door is like hers. Later you try again, knocking on a different house marked with no symbol at all. A man answers, face hard, words sharper. "Get off my property before I call the law." The door slams, and the echo rings in your chest louder than the hunger. That's the danger. You never know which version of America will open the door. The kind, the cautious, or the cruel. Back at the jungle that evening, you share your day's haul with others. Half a biscuit, a handful of apples snagged from an orchard. You listen as fellow hobos swap advice, each story reinforcing how thin the line is between surviving and starving. One man swears the trick is to sing a hymn when they open the door. Another insists you should carry an axe, so your promise to work feels less like a metaphor. Everyone's got a strategy, and none of them guarantee success. As the fire dies down, you reflect on the peculiar dignity in begging done right. It's not grovelling, it's bargaining, offering trust in exchange for mercy. Tomorrow you'll try again, knocking lightly, hoping the right person answers. Out here, every meal is a gamble, and you're betting your hunger against the kindness of strangers. Night after night, town after town, your clothes are starting to tell your story before you even open your mouth. The fabric is thin where it should be thick, patched where it should be whole, and fraying at every edge. You glance down at your shirt, noticing that the collar has been stitched in 2 different colours of thread. Somebody else's hands worked that repair long before the shirt ever belonged to you. That's the thing about a hobo's wardrobe. Every garment has already lived several lives before it finds its way onto your back. Walking through town, you pass a dry goods store with a shiny new pair of overalls displayed in the window. The price tag may as well be a joke. $2, a sum that feels as distant as the moon. You keep moving, knowing full well you'll be relying on hand-me-downs, donations, or whatever cast-offs you can scrounge. Hobos even had a system for trading clothes in jungle camps, like a swap meet without money. If someone's shoes didn't fit, they'd pass them along. If a shirt was too ragged, it might get cut into rags for bandages. Nothing ever truly went to waste. Here's the historical anchor. During the Depression, second-hand clothing became the backbone of survival, not just for hobos, but for millions of struggling families. Thrift shops run by charities like the Salvation Army thrived, offering garments for pennies or free. Hobos, often excluded from even those opportunities, relied heavily on what they could barter, scavenge or mend. Clothing was as much about utility as modesty. A sturdy coat meant you wouldn't freeze to death on a boxcar ride in January. Now for the quirky fact. Hobos were oddly proud of their ability to patch clothes. Some even stitched patterns or initials into their garments as a kind of signature. A well-done patch could spark conversation around a jungle fire, almost like showing off tattoos. And then there were the uniforms of the road. Overalls, wide-brimmed hats, bandanas tied just so, that created an unspoken dress code. You could spot another hobo from a mile away, not by their face but by the language of their clothes. Scholars, however, debate what these clothes really represented. Were patched garments symbols of resilience, proof of resourcefulness and creativity? Or did they serve as marks of shame, broadcasting poverty and exclusion from mainstream society? Some historians argue that hobos developed a kind of counter-fashion, a culture of practicality that rejected middle-class values. Others claim these clothes only reinforce stigma, making it harder for hobos to blend in and find work. As you run your fingers over the rough patches on your sleeve, you feel both truths pressing down. Pride in survival, but also the sting of being marked as less than. Later in camp, you sit beside an older man whose coat looks like it's been sewn together from 3 different others. He laughs as he describes how each patch reminds him of a different town. "This piece," he says, tapping a square of faded red cloth, "that came from a kind widow in St. Louis. And this blue stripe, swapped it off a fellow in Denver after his boots gave out." To him, his coat is less clothing than a scrapbook, a stitched-together history of the road. That night you notice how the firelight plays across the group, highlighting the odd mix of garments. Some men wear coats too big for them, cinched with rope. Others have pants rolled high because they were found too short in the first place. A pair of shoes is passed around the circle, each man trying them on like Cinderella's slipper, until one man's feet finally match. The laughter that follows isn't about fashion, it's about relief, the simple joy of something fitting for once. You bed down in your own patched clothes, wrapping your coat tight around you as the night grows cold. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and sweat, but it also carries the memory of every stranger who wore it before you. You drift off wondering if years from now someone else will wear your patched shirt, adding their own stitches, their own story to the fabric of survival. The rails give you freedom, but they also give you enemies. Tonight you're not thinking about stew or patched clothes, you're thinking about railway bulls. These are the men hired by the railroad companies to keep people like you off the trains. They don't wear fancy badges, but their authority is carved into every bruise and broken bone they've handed out. You can smell their presence long before you see them. The sudden hush in a jungle, the way hobos slip into shadows when a flashlight beam cuts through the night. You crouch low in the weeds near the siding, waiting for the freight to slow enough to climb aboard. Your heart hammers as the wheels squeal against the track, sparks flying into the dark. Just as you move, a shout cuts through the noise. "Hey, off there!" A bull's silhouette emerges, broad-shouldered, baton glinting under the lantern light. Your instincts scream "run," and so you do, crashing through weeds, breath tearing in your lungs, every step echoing with the thought that you might not get away. Here's the historical reality. Railway bulls were notorious during the Great Depression, and their brutality was well documented. Railroads were private property, and companies considered hobos both a nuisance and a liability. Bulls were paid to keep them off, often with violence. Broken ribs, cracked skulls, and even deaths weren't uncommon. Yet hobos kept coming, risking life and limb for the chance to ride steel across the country. Now for the quirky fact, some bulls developed reputations almost as legendary as the hobos themselves. There were stories of bulls so cunning they could sniff out a hobo hiding under a train, and others so mean they'd take your shoes just to teach you a lesson. But there were also tales of bulls who looked the other way if you kept quiet, or who'd let an old-timer ride in peace as long as he didn't cause trouble. Like everything else on the road, it came down to luck, and luck didn't always favour you. Scholars still debate whether bulls were simply enforcing law and order, or if they represented something darker, the policing of poverty itself. Were they protecting railroads, or were they punishing desperation? Some argue that bulls became symbols of a system that criminalised survival, turning hungry men into fugitives. Others see them as inevitable products of a chaotic era, rough men hired to keep rough order. Either way, when you're sprinting through the dark, none of that matters. All that matters is the pounding of boots behind you. You dive under a fence, scrape your arm on barbed wire, and don't stop until the lights of town fade behind you. When you finally collapse, chest heaving, you realise how close you came to being caught, or worse. You lie there in the grass, staring at the stars, and wonder how many hobos never got back up from a chase like that. Later, by a jungle fire, the stories flow thick and fast. One man swears he saw a bull toss a kid off a moving train. Another brags about outwitting a notorious bull by hiding in a water tower for 2 days. The tales get taller with every retelling, but the fear underneath is real. Everyone's got scars, visible or not, from encounters with men whose job was to remind you that survival had consequences. As you roll into your blanket that night, the sound of the rails in the distance makes you twitch. You know the trains are both salvation and threat, highways to freedom and hunting grounds for bulls. Tomorrow you'll climb aboard again because you have no choice. But tonight, lying in the dark, you can't shake the image of that lantern flashing, that shout cutting through the night. The road gives, but it also takes, and the bulls are there to make sure the balance is always a little cruel. The day after your run-in with the bull, you find yourself walking with a limp still sore from your sprint through barbed wire. Hunger pushes you forward, but what steadies you isn't just the promise of another meal, it's the knowledge that you're not alone out here. You're beginning to understand the road has its own family, a brotherhood stitched together, not by blood but by dust, smoke and steel rails. They call it the brotherhood of the road, and once you've shared stew from the same pot, you're in whether you like it or not. You first sense it around a campfire that evening. The men greet you without suspicion, offering a seat and a tin cup as though you were expected all along. No one asked where you're from or what you've lost. They already know the story. It's carved into your face, the same as theirs. Instead, they talk about tomorrow's trains, yesterday's towns, and rumours of work 2 states over. You realise quickly that out here, information is as valuable as food. Knowing which station has a lenient bull or which farmer pays with ham instead of cornbread can make the difference between surviving and starving. Here's a historical anchor. The Hobo Brotherhood wasn't just a poetic idea, it was a functioning network. Hobos shared resources, taught each other the Hobo Code, and even looked out for the young or inexperienced. At its best, it worked like a grassroots safety net during a time when the official safety nets of government and society had failed miserably. And the quirky side, hobos often referred to each other with nicknames instead of real names. Around the fire you might meet Lonesome Dan, Iowa Red, or Boxcar Benny. These names carried their own mythologies, earned through deeds, quirks, or just plain accidents. Sometimes the names stuck longer than the real ones, so much so that men could forget what they'd been called back when they had permanent addresses. You can already feel your own nickname bubbling up, though you're not sure what it'll be yet. But scholars question just how deep this brotherhood went. Was it true solidarity, or just a fragile alliance born of necessity? Some historians describe it as a powerful fraternity of outcasts who built a parallel society. Others argue it was more transactional, with friendships dissolving as quickly as they formed once the stew ran out or the train whistle blew. Sitting there with the fire warming your face, you wonder about that yourself. Will these men remember you tomorrow? Or will you be just another shadow in the endless parade of wanderers? Still, you can't deny the comfort of it. One man notices your limp and hands you a scrap of cloth to bind your leg. Another offers advice about catching trains from the south side of town. "Less heat that way," he says with a grin. It's generosity that comes not from abundance, but from shared scarcity. Out here, the only thing anyone has to give is what they can't afford to keep, and yet they give it anyway. As the night deepens, the conversation turns to philosophy. One man insists hobos are freer than anyone else in America. "No boss, no landlord, no mortgage," he says, puffing on a bent pipe. Another shakes his head, pointing out that freedom isn't worth much when your belly's empty. The debate hums under the stars, unresolved but important, a reminder that even men with nothing still wrestle with the meaning of it all. You fall asleep with your back against a wall, listening to the chorus of snores around you. For the first time in days, you don't feel completely exposed. The fire, the laughter, the murmured plans, they weave a net around you, fragile but real. You know the brotherhood won't stop the bulls from swinging their clubs or guarantee your next meal, but it offers something just as vital, the sense that you're not walking this endless road alone. You wake to the smell of wood smoke and something unexpected. Music. A man across the campfire strums a guitar so beaten it looks like it's survived 3 wars and a tornado, yet it still breathes sound. The strings buzz and twang, but the melody floats into the morning air with surprising grace. Music in the hobo world isn't decoration. It's medicine, history, and rebellions wrapped in 6 strings. You sip from a dented tin cup of coffee and let the sound soften the edges of your hunger. The song drifts from sorrow to laughter, each verse blending truth with exaggeration. One line mourns a sweetheart left behind, another cracks a joke about sleeping in a pigsty and calling it hotel accommodations. Around the fire, heads nod, some lips join in on the chorus. The music binds you tighter than any patchwork of clothes or stew pot could. For a few minutes, everyone forgets about the bulls, the hunger, the endless road. Instead, the jungle feels almost like home, one built on rhythm, rhyme, and resilience. Here's a historical fact to ground it. Hobo culture was steeped in music. Songs like Big Rock Candy Mountain captured the mix of longing and humour that defined the life. Hobos carried harmonicas, fiddles, and guitars, turning every jungle into a kind of folk concert hall. Their music spread through America, weaving into the fabric of folk and blues traditions that would influence generations. Now the quirky side, instruments weren't always real instruments. Hobos made fiddles out of cigar boxes, banjos from pie tins, even percussion with washboards or spoons. One man tells you proudly how he once strummed wire-nailed between 2 boards, claiming it sounded just like Nashville if you squint your ears. You can't help but laugh, but when he plucks a tune, the rhythm does in fact get your foot tapping. Out here, invention matters as much as talent. Yet scholars still debate what this music really represented. Was it escapism, a way of forgetting hunger for a few precious minutes? Or was it a form of protest, a coded language that turned suffering into art and solidarity? Some argue these songs were survival tools, keeping spirits alive in the face of despair. Others suggest they were more myth than reality, certain, with the image of the singing hobo romanticised after the Depression ended. You sit back and wonder, does it matter? The music in your ears is as real as the smoke in your lungs, and that's enough. As the sun climbs higher, the camp grows lively. A harmonica joins the guitar, and soon a fiddler cuts in with a tune sharp enough to make everyone laugh at the squeaky notes. A circle of men clap along, stomping their boots in rhythm. Even the weary faces of the children brighten. The jungle, usually grey with exhaustion, suddenly glows with energy. You feel it too, the music pumping something warm back into your veins, reminding you that the joy can exist even in the harshest corners of life. When night falls again, another fire sparks up. This time a man with a voice like gravel tells a story between songs, weaving music and narrative into one. He sings about riding boxcars through rainstorms, about tricking bulls, about finding a nickel, and buying a meal big enough for 3. The younger hobos lean in, hungry not just for food but for identity, for the sense that they're a part of something larger than their own footsteps. As you lie down later, the echoes of guitar strings linger in your ears, mixing with the distant wail of a train whistle. You close your eyes, realizing that music is more than sound out here. It's survival disguised as melody, hope disguised as rhythm. And tomorrow, when the road calls again, you'll carry those tunes with you like a secret weapon, humming them softly as the rails rattle beneath your feet. You're riding the rails again when you hear whispers about a figure that sounds half man, half myth, the Hobo King. Every community has legends, and in the hobo world, this one reigns supreme. Around jungle fires and train yards, names get passed like smuggled currency, stories of a drifter who could outwit bulls, charm farmers into feasts, and navigate the country without ever going hungry. Whether he was real or just stitched together from campfire imagination, the king became a symbol of the road's dream, survival elevated to art. Your first real brush with the legend comes when an older hobo called Missouri Jack tells you the tale. He swears the king once rode a single boxcar from Chicago to Los Angeles without once being spotted, hopping between cars like a phantom. Another man interrupts, insisting he met the king in St. Paul, where he supposedly negotiated free pie from a bakery just by tipping his hat. The stories contradict, overlap, and grow taller with each retelling, but no one around the fire doubts the king's existence. It's as though the myth is too useful to abandon. Here's the historical truth. The title Hobo King wasn't just campfire chatter. At the annual National Hobo Convention in Britt, Iowa, a real king of the hobos was crowned. Men like Steam Train Maury Graham wore the crown as symbolic leaders of the wandering tribe, giving speeches about the dignity of hobo life. The coronation added ceremony to a culture that otherwise thrived on the margins, a reminder that even drifters could create traditions of their own. The quirky side: the Hobo King sometimes took his duties surprisingly seriously. Accounts tell of kings mediating disputes between hobos, lobbying for better treatment, or even representing hobos in conversations with curious townsfolk. Some wore patched robes or carried homemade scepters as symbols of their rule. Imagine it, a man with holes in his boots giving a regal wave as other hobos cheered like loyal subjects. Ridiculous? Maybe, but also oddly moving. Scholars, of course, question whether the Hobo King represented anything more than spectacle. Was it genuine leadership, or just pageantry meant to ease the sting of poverty with a dose of theatre? Some argue the king gave hobos pride, reinforcing the sense of belonging in a society that otherwise rejected them. Others claim it was just a distraction, a temporary fantasy in a life defined by the struggle. As you listen to the campfire stories, you lean toward the first view. Even if the king never held real power, belief in him gave men something priceless, a reason to keep going. Later that night, a younger hobo with soot on his cheeks leans close and whispers, "I saw him once. He gave me a sandwich in Kansas City." You nod, though you don't know whether to believe him. The fire pops, the yerks flying upward, and the thought lingers. Maybe the king is just a role anyone can play. Maybe every act of kindness on the road, sharing stew, handing to him off a coat, strumming a guitar, is a crown passed from head to head. When you finally curl into your blanket, the legend of the Hobo King follows you into your dreams. In them, you see a man walking the rails with a crooked crown and a patched robe, leading an invisible parade of the forgotten. whether he was real or not, you realise something important. Survival on the road isn't just about food or warmth. It's also about stories. Myths that make the cold nights bearable and remind you that even nobodies can be kings, if only in the flicker of a jungle fire. The train lets you off near a town where the air smells faintly of yeast and coal smoke. Your belly twists, reminding you that it's been too long since your last full meal. You follow the line of men shuffling toward the church basement on the corner, drawn by the promise of food from the soup kitchen. Here, the difference between being a hobo and being just homeless sharpens. A hobo, you remind yourself, is a worker on the road. But when you stand in a line that stretches around the block, every label blurs into the same hungry silence. The building's steps creak under your boots as you file inside. The smell of cabbage soup hits first, watery with just enough fat to leave a shimmer on top. Volunteers ladle portions into chipped bowls, their faces a mixture of kindness and exhaustion. You grip yours tightly, retreating to a corner to eat. The first sip burns your tongue, but you don't care. Around you, men slurp quietly, some staring into their bowls like they are ashamed to look up. Hunger doesn't just gnaw at the stomach, it eats at pride. Here's a historical anchor. Soup kitchens became lifelines during the Great Depression. Churches, charities, and eventually government relief programs fed millions. Some lines stretched for blocks, with men waiting hours for bread and coffee. The most famous kitchen was in Chicago, run by gangster Al Capone of all people. He served thousands of meals a day, partly as public service, partly as a calculated PR move. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The law couldn't provide, but an outlaw could. Now for the quirky detail, some soup kitchens had reputations that spread like rumour has among hobos. St. Mary's serves meat on Fridays, someone might whisper by a jungle fire. Others became known for stingy portions, or for sermons longer than the meal. Hobos developed strategies, arrive just before closing when volunteers were more generous with leftovers, or stand near children to soften hearts. You realise quickly that even soup lines have their politics, their own invisible rules to navigate. But scholars argue over what these lines represented. Were they symbols of communal resilience, evidence that Americans pulled together in crisis? Or were they proof of systemic failure, of a society that forced its citizens into queues for watery broth? Some historians emphasize the dignity volunteers tried to preserve. Others focus on the humiliation endured by those who had to stand there day after day. Sitting with your bowl, you feel both truths sting at once. When you leave, you step into the sunlight with a full stomach but an emptier sense of self. The line is longer now, winding down the block, and you catch a glimpse of men who look just like you. Worn boots, patched coats, eyes darting toward the ground. Some are hobos who'll hop the next freight. Others are locals who once owned stores or farms but lost it all. Hunger has levelled the playing field, erasing the old borders between wanderer and townsman. Back at the jungle, the talk circles around the difference between hobos and the bums who stayed in soup lines all day. One man insists hobos still have pride because they trade labour for food when they can. Another scoffs, saying, "Soup's soup, don't matter how you get it." You don't join the debate, but inside you know, survival doesn't wear neat labels. Pride is easy to talk about, harder to chew on when your stomach is empty. That night as you bed down, the smell of cabbage soup lingers in your mind. It wasn't much, but it kept you moving, and that's the whole point. Tomorrow you'll chase another rumour of work, another porch, another chalk-marked gate. The line between hobo and homeless may blur, but for now your boots still walk the rails, and that movement feels like the last fragile thread tying you to dignity. You've learnt that maps aren't always drawn on paper. Out here, they're carried in the minds of hobos, pieced together from scraps of rumour, half-truths, and first-hand tales swapped by the fire. Tonight you sit with a circle of men tracing invisible lines in the dirt. One points west, saying there's orchard work in Washington. Another swears there's a cannery hiring in California, though someone else snorts and calls it a lie. The debate rages on. But the truth doesn't matter as much as the hope. Each story becomes a compass needle, pointing you toward the possibility of a meal. Walking the rails, you realise how quickly memory becomes your greatest tool. You remember which towns had kind kitchens, which farms offered work, and which streets reeked of hostility. The map unfolds in your mind, not drawn in neat lines, but in vivid impressions, like the smell of biscuits baking near a house with a chalked cat symbol. or the sound of boots on gravel where bulls once chased you off the siding. No atlas could ever capture these details. Here's your historical anchor. During the Depression, hobos truly did rely on oral maps. They traded intelligence about jobs and safe routes the way merchants once traded spices. Even government relief offices often spread information unevenly, so hobos became their own news network, passing word from rail line to rail line. Some historians argue that this web of memory and rumour resembled a primitive postal service, complete with relay points at jungles and train yards. Now, for a quirky fact, some hobos were so skilled at remembering routes and resources that they became unofficial guides. They'd lead groups of younger wanderers through towns, showing them which back doors to knock on or which bridges had the best hiding spots under them. A few even claimed to know shortcuts across states by following specific freight schedules, as though they carried invisible timetables in their heads. You wonder if your brain will one day be as cluttered with landmarks that no mapmaker has ever written down. But scholars still debate the reliability of this oral geography. Were hobos genuinely mapping America in their minds, or just chasing endless chains of exaggerated rumours? Some researchers say these memory maps were precise, refined over years of first-hand experience. Others argue they were more like folklore tales, blending fact and fantasy until the truth blurred beyond recognition. When someone insists there's steady work in the next town, do you trust him? Or is it just wishful thinking passed along like a game of telephone? You test the system yourself. Following the advice of a man named Kansas Pete, you head north to a town where, supposedly, the bakery sells day-old bread for pennies. Sure enough, the rumour holds true. The baker's wife hands you 2 loaves, smiling as though she's in on the secret. Later, you follow another tip about easy train hopping outside the rail yard. That one, however, nearly lands you in the grip of a bull's club. The road teaches you fast. Trust the map, but trust your gut more. One evening, sitting near the fire, a hobo scratches lines in the dirt with a stick, trying to draw an actual map of the Midwest. Others crowd around, arguing over which town is east of which, voices rising as the lines tangle. You laugh quietly, realizing the map isn't really the point. What matters is the act of remembering together, of building a shared knowledge that makes the vast, indifferent country feel just a little smaller. When you curl into your blanket that night, the rails hum faintly in the distance, like strings of a giant instrument vibrating under the stars. You close your eyes and picture the mental map you're building, dots of kindness, dashes of danger, paths carved from memory. It's not precise, and it won't keep you safe from every bull or every hunger bang, but it's yours, and it's growing with each mile that you walk. In a world where you own almost nothing, that map feels like treasure stitched directly into your mind. The rhythm of the rails teaches you something quickly. Hunger has its seasons. In summer and fall, the air smells sweet with possibility. Orchards ripe for picking, fields heavy with grains, canneries buzzing with the clang of tin. In winter and early spring, though, the land feels barren, and so does your stomach. Tonight you sit by the fire, chewing slowly on a piece of dried bread, while older hobos swap stories about the months that can make or break a man. During harvest time, the road almost feels forgiving. You remember stumbling into an apple orchard in Oregon, the trees bending low with fruit. The farmer shouted at first, but when you offered to pick, he shrugged and handed you a basket. That day you ate until your belly ached, apple juice sticky on your hands, pockets stuffed with extras for the journey. For a moment, the depression felt like it couldn't touch you. Nature was too abundant to care about Wall Street. Here's the historical reality. Seasonal agricultural work was one of the biggest lifelines for hobos. Migrant labour drew thousands westward, especially to California, where fields of lettuce, grapes and cotton promised temporary salvation. Whole families followed the harvests, living in tents or makeshift shacks near the fields. But the work was grueling, the pay often pennies, and competition fierce. Still, it kept people alive when factories shut down and cities offered nothing but soup lines. Now for the quirky side, hobos sometimes developed their own menus of seasonal travel. Spring meant heading south for planting. Summer meant orchards in the west or wheat harvests in the Midwest. Autumn meant cotton or corn. Winter meant desperation, cutting firewood, shoveling snow, or just clinging to whatever scraps could be found. Some hobos even sang songs about the calendar of the road, as if hunger itself had scheduled appointments. But scholars debate whether this migration was freedom or bondage. Some describe it as a nomadic lifestyle that allowed hobos to chase opportunity across the country, an echo of frontier independence. Others see it as exploitation, cheap, disposable labour shuffled from one crop to the next, with no stability and no future. As you hear men argue around the fire, one praising the open road, another cursing the fields that left his back twisted, you realise both sides hold weight. You recall a darker season, winter in Minnesota. The fields were bare, the snow relentless. You huddled in a boxcar with 3 others, trying to keep warm with shared breath and the faint heat from a candle stub. Food was scarce, and even the soup kitchens had more mouths than bowls. That season carved itself into your bones. You learned that hunger doesn't just gnaw, it freezes, stiffens, and leaves you dreaming of orchards you may never see again. In contrast, harvest seasons glitter like salvation. You remember another camp, this time in Iowa, where hobos boiled corn in a black pot until the kernels popped off in sweet bursts. The jungle smelled like roasted grain, laughter mixing with the steam. A younger hobo, barely 16, grinned with the butter smeared across his chin, proclaiming it was the best feast of his life. In that moment, you saw how a simple crop could turn strangers into a family, at least for one golden evening. As you bed down tonight, you think about the strange bargain the seasons demand. Nature offers her gifts, but only when she chooses, not when you need them most. To survive the road, you learn to move with her rhythms, following the crops, dodging the famine. Hunger, you realise, is not just about empty pockets. It's about time itself, whether you arrive in the season of plenty, or in the long, barren stretch when even the earth seems to say no. The road doesn't just test your stomach and your feet, it tests your conscience. One cold evening, as you crouch behind a grocery store, staring at the crates stacked by the back door, you feel the question press on you like a weight. Do you take what you need, or do you walk away hungry? Out here, the line between stealing and surviving blurs until you're not sure which side you're on anymore. You remember the first time you crossed it. A half-rotten loaf of bread sat on top of a trash bin, barely edible, but your hands shook as you grabbed it. The guilt hit almost as hard as the hunger. Later you learned there were unwritten rules. Don't take from people poorer than you, avoid stealing if honest work is possible, and if you do swipe something, make it small just enough to get by. Yet rules don't fill a belly, and desperation rarely cares about morality. Here's the historical anchor. Crime rates during the Great Depression did rise, but not always in the ways you'd expect. Many hobos committed what authorities called petty theft. Food, clothing, or coal swiped from trains. Railroads even reported whole carloads of coal mysteriously lighter by the time they arrived, thanks to men tossing lumps off to stash along the tracks. It wasn't about riches, it was about staying alive through one more night. Now the quirky fact, hobos sometimes used humour to soften the moral sting. They'd joke about borrowing bread from the baker or liberating a chicken. One tale tells of a hobo who left IOU notes when he swiped apples, signing them "The Hungry Traveller." Whether true or just a tall tale, it shows how even theft became part of the storytelling culture, wrapped in wit to make survival sound less like sin. But scholars debate whether hobos were criminals by necessity or simply scapegoats for wider societal failures. Some historians argue that the stereotype of hobos as thieves was exaggerated by newspapers eager for headlines. Others claim theft was common enough to blur the distinction between survival and crime. Was society punishing genuine wrongdoing or just the audacity of being poor in public? As you tuck that half-rotten bread into your coat, you feel the weight of both sides, guilty and justified, all at once. One night in a jungle, you listen as men swap their own borrowed goods stories. One brags about sneaking a pie off a windowsill, though others laugh and say no pie ever sat that conveniently. Another confesses to hitching a ride on the back of a milk truck, sipping cream straight from the bottles until his stomach ached. Each story dances between shame and pride, survival and sin, but the darker tales slip in too. A man whispers about being caught swiping from a store and beaten by both the owner and the bull before being dumped outside of town. Another describes watching a friend shot at for stealing chickens. The laughter quiets, and everyone stares into the fire. The road may forgive theft, but the world often doesn't. As you curl under your blanket that night, you wonder what kind of man you're becoming. You don't want to be a thief, yet you also don't want to starve. The rails hum faintly in the distance, carrying you toward another choice, another moral test. Out here, survival means learning to live in the grey, where every meal comes with a question you don't always want to answer. It surprises you the first time you see it. Romance on the rails. You'd always imagined the hobo world as all grit and grit alone. Patched clothes, tin cups, bruised knuckles. But one evening, in a jungle outside Kansas City, you notice a woman sitting by the fire, her hair tied back with a bright red scarf that catches the glow like a flame. Beside her, a young man strums a guitar, eyes never leaving hers as he sings some half-made-up ballad about wandering and finding love in unlikely places. You can't help but smirk. Even here, with hunger gnawing and bulls prowling, sparks still fly. Romance on the road wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible either. Women travelled the rails too, alone, with children, or sometimes with partners. The hardships didn't erase the human need for tenderness, for companionship. A stolen glance, a shared meal, or a walk along the tracks could feel like gold when everything else was rust. Hobos even claimed that a kiss around a jungle fire was worth more than a day's pay, because it reminded them they were still human. Here's the historical fact. While the majority of hobos were men, women did make up a small but significant percentage of the travelling population. Some estimates put the number at around 5–10%. Women rode the rails for the same reasons men did: job loss, eviction, broken families, but faced double the dangers. Stories survive of female hobos disguising themselves as men for safety, binding their hair and lowering their voices just to blend in. Now for the quirky side, a few hobos swore by hobo weddings. These weren't official ceremonies, of course, but improvised unions sealed by sharing food, swapping trinkets, or simply declaring loyalty in front of witnesses. Sometimes they lasted only until the next train pulled out. Other times, couples rode together for years, their love stitched tighter than their patched clothes. Jungle gossip claimed you could tell a hobo couple by the way they shared chores, she stirring the pot, he tending the fire, though the roles weren't always so fixed. Scholars debate how much of this romance was real and how much was romanticised after the fact. Were these relationships genuine bonds forged in hardship, or were they exaggerated tales told later to soften the grim image of the Depression? Some argue that women hobos were often erased from the historical record, their stories hidden behind stereotypes of male wanderers. Others caution against over-romanticising, just pointing out that danger and exploitation were never far behind. Watching that red-scarfed woman laugh at the guitar player's clumsy rhyme, you feel both truths humming beneath the moment. Tenderness exists, but it's fragile, risky, fleeting. Later, as the night deepens, you catch snippets of conversation from the couple. They dream aloud of finding steady work in California, of maybe even settling down. The others listen with a mix of envy and amusement. "Love don't fill your belly," one man mutters, though his eyes soften as he watches them. Even cynics crave what they claim doesn't matter. As you lie back, the guitar still faintly strumming, you wonder what it would be like to have someone beside you on the road. Not just for survival, but for warmth of a different kind. Maybe you'd share more than stew and stories. Maybe you'd share the weight of the hunger, the fear, the endless miles. Out here, romance is a gamble with stakes higher than any poker game. But for some, the risk is worth it. For now, you pull your blanket tighter and drift to sleep with the tune of that makeshift love song echoing in your ears. Your stomach isn't the only thing that suffers on the road. Tonight, as you sit by the fire, an older hobo wheezes beside you, coughing so hard it rattles his whole frame. No doctors are coming to this jungle. Out here, sickness is treated with whatever knowledge, superstition, or scraps of medicine a man can scrounge. They call them hobo doctors, not professionals, but wanderers who've picked up tricks from farm wives, old manuals, or sheer trial and error. One such doctor, a wireman with spectacles missing one lens, digs into a sack and pulls out a bundle of dried herbs. He brews them into a bitter tea, swearing it'll settle the cough. Another hobo, skeptical but desperate, gulps it down, grimacing as though he's swallowed fire. Within an hour, the coughing quiets, though whether it's the tea or sheer luck, nobody can say. Still, the doctor earns a reputation, and by morning men are lining up for advice about blisters, cuts, and aching teeth. Here's a historical anchor. During the Great Depression, access to medical care plummeted. Clinics were overwhelmed, hospitals often turned away those who couldn't pay, and hobos had even less chance of treatment. Folk medicine became the default. Home remedies passed along from camp to camp. Some used onion poultices for infections, mustard plasters for chest pain, or turpentine mixed with sugar for stomach troubles. Primitive, yes, but sometimes better than nothing. And here's the quirky side. Hobos sometimes believed in charms and rituals as much as herbs. One man swore by carrying a rabbit's foot for good health. Another claimed rubbing tobacco juice on wounds sped healing. There were even whispered cures involving railroad grease, though nobody ever seemed eager to demonstrate. It wasn't science, it was hope stitched together with whatever scraps the road provided. But scholars debate how effective these cures really were. Some argue that folk remedies preserved valuable traditions, especially those rooted in indigenous or immigrant knowledge. Others dismiss them as dangerous quackery, noting that untreated infections or illnesses often proved fatal. The question lingers: were hobos resourceful healers, or victims of desperation forced to gamble their lives on guesswork? Watching the so-called doctor mix another foul-smelling concoction, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. One night fever grips you hard, your body shakes, sweat soaking your patched shirt. The jungle doctor presses a rag dipped in vinegar to your forehead and mutters that it'll draw out the heat. You choke down his bitter tea, half convinced it'll kill you faster. But by morning the fever breaks, and you're sitting up, weak but alive. The men cheer softly, as if survival itself deserves applause. Maybe it was the tea, maybe it was your body finally winning its own battle. Either way, you live to ride again. Around the fire, the men trade their own folk remedies. One insists garlic cloves cure anything from toothaches to heartbreak. Another swears that rubbing whiskey on sore feet makes them stronger. You chuckle, but you file the tips away. You never know when desperation will make you try them. The jungle becomes not just a kitchen or a tavern, but a clinic where survival knowledge is passed along like recipes. That night, lying under your blanket, you feel grateful not just for stew or fire, but for the strange ragtag doctors of the road. They may not have diplomas or sterile tools, but they've kept men alive with nothing more than weeds, spit, and stubborn faith. And in a world where a cough can be a death sentence, that's a kind of medicine no hospital ledger can measure. The freight train groans into motion, and tonight you're not inside a boxcar. You're clinging underneath it, pressed against the steel beams like a barnacle on a whale. This trick is called riding the rods, and it's as dangerous as it sounds. Your body shakes with every jolt, the cold iron cutting into your palms. Sparks spit from the wheels inches away from your boots. You know one slip won't mean a bruise or a chase from a bull. It'll mean being ground into the tracks, forgotten before dawn. The reason you're down here instead of inside? Bulls have gotten sharper. Boxcars are locked, doors chained, and guards patrol like wolves. The underside is the only option if you want to keep moving. You hear the whistle howl, the engine roaring forward, and the vibration rattles through your bones. Each second stretches into eternity as you cling harder, eyes watering from the wind and grit. You tell yourself you'll let go at the next slow siding, but part of you knows you'll push further, because hunger always pushes further. Here's the historical fact. Riding the rods was one of the most common yet most lethal methods hobos used to travel. The rods were the narrow supports beneath freight cars, barely wide enough for a man to lie flat. Thousands attempted it, thousands died when fatigue, wind, or sudden jolts knocked them loose. Newspapers of the era carried grim accounts of bodies found along tracks, nameless drifters who gambled and lost. Yet despite the danger, the practice endured, because there was no cheaper ticket than free. Now for the quirky side, hobos developed a sort of grim humour about it. Some bragged about first-class rods, the smoother beams under certain train models. Others joked about rod insurance, a bottle of whiskey to calm the nerves before crawling underneath. There were even tales of men napping while riding the Ros, though you suspect that's more legend than fact. Still, the humour softened the terror, making the deadly ride feel like another shared joke in the brotherhood. Scholars debate what this practice symbolises. Was it recklessness, proof that hobos flirted with death out of desperation? Or was it ingenuity, a raw demonstration of human adaptability under crushing circumstances? Some call it tragic folly, others call it courage. As your muscles burn and your fingers cramp, you feel both interpretations alive in your shaking body. Foolishness and bravery holding hands in the dark. Hours stretch on, your ears ring with the constant metallic roar, and your teeth chatter so hard you fear they'll crack. You press your cheek against the cold beam, praying the train slows soon. When it finally does, you roll onto the gravel, trembling, your clothes torn and your arms raw from gripping steel. The train shrieks past, indifferent, while you collapse on your back staring at the stars. You're alive, though you can't quite believe it. Later, by the fire, you describe the ride to others. They nod with solemn respect, no laughter this time. Everyone here has ridden the rods at least once, and everyone knows a friend who didn't make it. The silence that follows feels heavier than any story. Riding the rods isn't an adventure, it's a gamble with the Reaper, and somehow tonight you walked away with your skin intact. As you close your eyes, the memory won't fade. The iron beams, the roaring wheels, the black wind tearing at your body, it replays in your head, sharp and vivid. You know you'll probably do it again because survival leaves little choice. But deep inside, you also know that every time you crawl under a train, you're bargaining with death, and death always keeps the better hand. The road doesn't just belong to lone wanderers. Sometimes it belongs to whole families. You see them first on a dusty highway in Oklahoma, their jalopy piled high with pots, blankets, and a mattress strapped to the roof. Kids dangle their legs from the back, hair tangled with dust, eyes too old for their faces. These are the children of the Dust Bowl, refugees of wind and drought, drifting westward in search of work and dignity. Their story runs parallel to yours, but with heavier stakes. They can't slip under a train car and vanish. They carry their whole world with them. When you share a camp with them one night, the difference becomes clear. The father chops wood while the mother stirs a pot of thin stew, trying to stretch it so 6 mouths can taste something. The children sit cross-legged, staring at the pot as if willing it to multiply. You notice their clothes, patched like yours, but smaller, sadder somehow. Hunger on a grown man's face looks rugged. On a child's it looks cruel. Here's the historical fact. By the mid-1930s, more than 200,000 people fled the Dust Bowl states. Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas, heading mostly to California. They were dubbed Okies regardless of their true origin, and many wound up in migrant camps picking fruit or cotton. John Steinbeck immortalized them in The Grapes of Wrath, but before literature claimed their story, they lived it daily, with no guarantee of tomorrow's bread. Now the quirky detail, despite their poverty, some families turned their jalopies into rolling palaces of ingenuity. You'd see stoves welded to bumpers, chicken coops tied to fenders, or entire water barrels lashed on top. Kids sometimes rode in crates bolted to the sides, laughing at the wind as if it were a carnival ride. Survival demanded creativity, and these families became travelling engineers, making machines out of scrap and hope. Scholars debate how much solidarity existed between hobos and these families. Were they part of the same community of the dispossessed, or did differences in circumstance set them apart? Some accounts suggest hobos often helped families, sharing food or watching children while parents hunted work. Others hint at tension, with families resenting single men who were seen as competition for scarce jobs. Watching the family at your camp, you sense both dynamics at play. Compassion tempered by the grim fact that too many hungry mouths can make allies into rivals. One evening, you share your bread with the youngest child, a girl with braids and sharp eyes. She smiles, showing a missing tooth, and for a fleeting second, the road feels less cruel. But then her mother thanks you with a weary nod, and you see the weight in her gaze, gratitude wrapped around exhaustion, the look of someone who's been strong too long. When the family drives away at dawn, their jalopy rattling like it might fall apart on the first hill, you feel the emptiness they leave behind. You know you'll keep moving light, your belongings tied to a bindle, but their image will ride with you. Children on the road remind you of the stakes, of the thin line between survival and collapse. They prove the Depression wasn't just a tale of wandering men, it was a saga that dragged whole generations across dust, rails, and broken highways. That night, staring into the fire, you hear one of the older hobos mutter, "Kids shouldn't have to ride the road?" No one answers. Everyone just stares at the flames, knowing saltness is the only truth big enough to hold that thought. You walk into a city expecting bright lights and opportunity, but instead you find a sprawl of shacks stitched together from tar paper, tin scraps, and whatever else people can scavenge. Smoke curls lazily from barrel fires. Children chase each other barefoot through mud, and the air smells of wood smoke, garbage, and desperation. This is a Hooverville, one of the shanty towns that mushroomed across America during the Great Depression. Named with bitter sarcasm after President Hoover, these makeshift villages became the gathering places of the forgotten, where hobos, jobless families, and displaced workers cobbled together lives out of debris. You step carefully down a dirt path between shacks. A man hammers flattened tin cans into his roof while his wife stirs a pot balanced on 3 bricks. The pot smells like cabbage water, with maybe a bone tossed in. Children peer at you with cautious eyes, their faces smudged with soot. It looks less like a neighbourhood and more like a city made of ghosts, each shack a monument to lives erased by banks and dust. Here's the historical anchor. Hooverville sprang up in nearly every major city during the Depression. Seattle, Chicago, New York. Each had sprawling settlements, often on public land or riverbanks. They were rarely sanctioned, sometimes bulldozed by police, but they always rose again because the need didn't vanish. They weren't lawless chaos either. Many had self-appointed mayors, rules against stealing, and makeshift services like barber chairs or communal kitchens. Survival demanded order even in a world built from scraps. Now for the quirky detail, some residents injected humour into the bleakness. They gave ironic names to their shacks, the Ritz Palace Hotel, scrawled proudly on warped wood, some decorated walls with calendars or newspaper clippings, creating homes out of fragments of normal life. There were even makeshift churches and tiny theatres where someone might strum a guitar or recite poetry. Poverty didn't erase the human itch for art or laughter, it just forced it into new shapes. But scholars debate what Hoovervilles represented. Were they symbols of resilience, evidence that people could build community even in the harshest times? Or were they evidence of systemic collapse, the state's failure to protect its citizens? Some historians argue they were both, tragic proof of neglect, yet also living demonstrations of human adaptability. As you stand in the middle of the shantytown, the weight of both interpretations presses on you. It feels like standing in a museum of survival, every shack a stubborn protest against oblivion. You're invited to sit by a barrel fire where a family shares what little they have, thin soup ladled into tin cans. The taste is weak but warming, and the simple act of being offered food touches you deeply. Around the fire, conversations range from bitter jokes about Hoover to whispered rumours of jobs on the other side of town. Hope flickers here, fragile as the flames, but it's hope all the same. At night, the Hooverville glows with dozens of tiny fires, each one a small declaration. We are still here. You lie down on a borrowed blanket inside a shack with walls so thin you can see the stars through the gaps. The wind whistles, rattling the tin roof, but you're not alone. The murmur of voices, the laughter of children, and the soft clang of someone hammering late into the night weave into a lullaby. As sleep creeps in, you realise this place is more than a shelter. It's a reminder that even when stripped of everything, money, land, security, people still build, share, and dream. The shacks may look fragile, but the spirit inside them is anything but. By the time you roll into Chicago, you've heard whispers of a place the hobos call Hobohemia. It isn't marked on any official map, but every wanderer knows where to find it. The area around the West Madison Street Skid Row. The sidewalks are crowded with men in patched coats, sitting on stoops, swapping rumours and scratching chalk symbols onto posts. Coffee houses reek of tobacco smoke, while flop houses advertise a bed for a nickel if you're lucky. If the jungles are small fires in the woods, Hobohemia is the capital city of the road. You drift into a cheap diner where the clatter of plates mixes with the drone of conversation. Every table is filled with wanderers like you, their voices low but animated. One man leans over his coffee, muttering about job leads in the stockyards. Another talks about a generous church nearby. Someone else scribbles notes on a scrap of paper like he's charting a map of survival. It feels less like a diner and more like a parliament of the dispossessed. Here's the historical anchor. Chicago truly was the beating heart of hobo culture during the Depression. The city's railroads made it a hub for travellers, while Skid Row offered cheap lodging, soup kitchens and gathering places. It was in Chicago that sociologists began studying hobos seriously, documenting their slang, rituals and networks. For a brief time, the hobo became more than just a shadow figure. He became a subject of academic fascination. Now for the quirky side, Hobohemia had its own culture that blurred into performance. Hobos gave speeches on corners, reciting poetry or railing against the government. Some even staged mock trials or impromptu debates in flop houses. One famous spot, Bughouse Square, became a soapbox arena where anyone could stand and argue philosophy, politics, or religion to a rowdy crowd of wanderers and locals alike. Imagine it, a man with holes in his boots debating capitalism versus socialism under a street lamp. His audience a mix of professors, vagabonds, and curious kids. But scholars debate whether Hobohemia was truly a community or just a temporary crossroads. Was it an actual cultural capital with identity and solidarity? Or was it merely a symptom of urban poverty clustering together? Some argue it gave hobos dignity, a place where they weren't outcasts but citizens of their own republic. Others insist it was nothing more than a slum romanticised in hindsight. As you sip your watery coffee and listen to the chatter, you sense it's both, a place born of desperation, yet brimming with life and meaning. You wander the streets that evening, watching as neon signs flicker against the shadows. A street preacher bellows warnings of sin while a fiddler plays a quick tune nearby. Men cluster in alleys, some swapping advice, others just staring into space. Despite the hardship, the air buzzes with energy, an undercurrent of survival and defiance. This isn't a graveyard. It's a hidden city, alive in its own ragged way. When night falls, you curl into a bunk in a flop house, the smell of sweat and tobacco thick in the air. The man in the bed beside you snores loudly, muttering now and then about trains and lost towns. As you close your eyes, you think about Hobohemia not as a place of shame, but as proof of something remarkable. Even when stripped of home and money, people create a society out of scraps. A capital for the wandering stitched together from hunger, talk, and stubborn human need. The farther you travel, the more you realise that the road isn't just filled with hungry bellies, it's also thick with voices, each one eager to spin wisdom, preach salvation, or simply tell a tale taller than a grain silo. Around a campfire one evening, a wiry man with a beard down to his chest begins reciting verses of poetry, his voice low and hypnotic. He calls himself the Bard of the Rails, and his words flow like water over stone, describing sunsets on boxcars and the loneliness of the road. The others nod, soothed, as though he's casting a spell. Not long after, another figure bursts into the circle, Bible clutched tight, eyes burning with zeal. He paces like a caged animal, declaring that salvation is the only true bread. Some men roll their eyes, others listen earnestly. Out here, even preachers ride the rails, swapping pulpits for boxcars. And then there are the prophets, not men of scripture, but visionaries of the road, claiming they've seen a future where hobos rise up and form their own nation. Their voices carry half-mad conviction, but in a world where certainty has collapsed, even madness can sound like hope. Here's the historical anchor. During the Depression, hobos were notorious for gathering storytellers, poets, and preachers in their ranks. Some were educated men who'd lost jobs, others were natural performers. In Chicago's Bughouse Square and hobo jungles alike, speeches and poetry became common. Oral tradition was a lifeline. Not just entertainment, but a way to pass on lessons, keep spirits alive, and preserve culture. Now for the quirky fact, some hobos carried hobo poetry books, tattered notebooks filled with verses copied from each other or invented on the spot. Others carved poems into boxcar walls, turning train cars into travelling libraries of scratchy script. And preachers? Some were sincere, but others and boers were more opportunistic. Men who learned that quoting scripture could win you meals just as easily as begging. Imagine a sermon ending not with an altar call, but with the preacher asking if anyone had bread to spare. Scholars debate the significance of these voices. Were they simply diversions, a way to kill time around the fire? Or did they represent something deeper, a cultural backbone that gave the hobo world identity and dignity? Some argue that hobo poets and prophets were part of a larger tradition of working-class art, overlooked because of its rough edges. Others caution that many tales were exaggerated, their impact inflated by nostalgia. Still, sitting in the firelight listening to the words rise and fall, you feel they matter more than historians admit. The preacher finishes his fiery sermon, wiping sweat from his brow, and the poet cuts in with a witty rhyme about stew that makes the whole circle laugh. The mood shifts from solemn to playful in seconds, proving that these voices aren't competing, they're complementing. Each fills a different hunger, one for meaning, one for beauty, one for laughter. Later, as you lie down with the fire still glowing faintly, you replay the words in your mind. You realise the road isn't silent, even if the world tries to pretend it doesn't exist. It's filled with stories, verses, and proclamations, echoing off the rails like sermons in a cathedral made of iron and sky. And whether or not they change you anything in the long run, they change you in the moment, reminding you that even in rags, humans can't stop speaking their truths into the dark. After weeks of drifting, you start to notice the same question trailing you like a shadow. Are you free, or just desperate? Sitting on the edge of a boxcar at sunset, wind in your face, it feels like freedom. No boss yelling, no rent due, no schedule chaining you to a clock. You You can step off anywhere, change your direction with the rails, chase rumours like a gambler chasing dice, but when your stomach growls loud enough to drown out the train's rhythm, freedom tastes a lot like hunger. Around the fire one night, the debate comes alive. A grey-bearded hobo claims the road is the last frontier of liberty. "We're kings out here," he says, pointing his spoon at the stars. "Answer to no one. Pay no landlord. Wander where we please." Another man spits into the dirt, unimpressed. "Kings don't beg bread," he mutters. "This ain't freedom, it's desperation in disguise." The circle grows quiet, each man staring into the stew pot as though it might hold the answer. Here's the historical anchor. Hobos themselves often wrestled with this dual identity. Some frame their lifestyle as chosen independence, rejecting mainstream society and its failures. Others admitted it was necessity, born of unemployment and eviction. The distinction even shaped language. Hobos were seen as workers on the move, tramps as wanderers avoiding work, and bums as men who stayed put with no ambition. Labels tried to impose order, but lived experience blurred them constantly. Now for the quirky detail, some hobos leaned into the freedom image so hard they styled themselves as knights of the road. They created tall tales about heroic journeys, mythical battles with bulls and romances under the stars. One man even carried a battered chess set, declaring himself king of the open board, playing games with strangers at every jungle. It was half performance, half belief, a way of rewriting desperation into dignity. But scholars debate whether this self-styled freedom really held substance. Was the road an alternative lifestyle, a counterculture before its time, or was it merely survival dressed up in poetry and bravado? Some researchers argue hobos carved out a genuine subculture of independence, with rituals, codes, and myths that rivaled any community. Others claim the freedom was illusory, shattered the moment hunger, cold, or police interference struck. You sit listening to the debate and realise the answer may change depending on the day, or the meal. Later, lying under the stars, you feel both truths in your bones. The vast night sky stretches above, so infinite it makes you dizzy. In that moment, you're freer than any banker locked in his mansion. But when your empty stomach clenches, you also know the road has shackled you in its own way. Maybe freedom and desperation aren't opposites here. Maybe they're two sides of the same coin, flipping endlessly every time the rails rattle beneath you. As you drift to sleep, you imagine explaining this to someone safe at home. How could you tell them the road is both prison and paradise, that you've never felt poorer, yet never felt more alive? Maybe you wouldn't tell them at all. Maybe the road only makes sense to those walking it, stumbling between freedom and necessity with every mile. The road has a way of turning every man into a character. Around the fire, you rarely hear real names. Instead, you meet men called Freight Yard Slim, Oklahoma Tom, or Two Socks Joe. Each nickname carries a story, sometimes glorious, sometimes embarrassing, always retold with enough exaggeration to stick forever. You quickly learn that nicknames are more than jokes. They're survival tools, a way to claim an identity bigger than your hunger. You earn yours one night after tripping over a camp kettle and spilling stew all over your boots. Laughter erupts, and by morning someone's calling you Stewfoot. It sticks. At first you bristle, but later you realise there's pride in having a hobo name. It means you belong, you've stepped into the folklore of the road, where even accidents become legends whispered from one jungle to another. Here's the historical anchor. Hobos often relied on nicknames to mark their place in the culture. Names reflected origins, Dakota Dan, talents, Banjo Pete, or quirks, Sleepy Jim. They were easier to remember than legal names, and they carried no baggage of family shame or unpaid debts. In a sense, nicknames freed men to reinvent themselves, shedding the identities they'd lost along with their jobs and homes. Now the quirky fact. Tall tales clung to these names like vines. One man might be said to have outrun a bull for 10 miles. Another claimed he rode the rods across 3 states without blinking. There were stories of men who cooked legendary stews, strummed invisible guitars, or even wrestled raccoons for dinner. The truth didn't matter as much as the laughter they sparked. Exaggeration was part of the game, a way of turning misery into something worth repeating. Scholars debate whether these nicknames and tales were escapism or genuine culture building. Some historians see them as coping mechanisms, masking trauma with humour. Others argue they formed a vital oral tradition, a folklore as rich as that of sailors or cowboys. Around the fire, you don't care about academic debates. You just feel the power of laughter rising out of hunger, proof that stories can feed spirits even when stew runs thin. One evening, a man named Railroad Johnny tells the story of how he supposedly once rode a freight car backward through a blizzard, steering it like a sleigh. The circle erupts in howls of disbelief, but no one asks for proof. The story is the proof. Another hobo chimes in with a tale about being chased by a farmer's goose that turned into a months-long rivalry, complete with ambushes and counterattacks. You laugh until your ribs ache, realizing the road is as much about these moments as about bread or work. When you bed down that night, you test your new name on your tongue. Stewfoot. It sounds ridiculous, but also solid, like a badge you've earned in a strange army of wanderers. Out here, the world strips you of everything: money, home, pride, but it gives back something unexpected. A character, a legend, a place in the folklore of survival. And tomorrow, when you introduce yourself to a new circle, you won't be nameless. You'll be Stewfoot, and that will be enough. By the late 1930s, whispers of a storm across the ocean drift into the jungles and flop houses. Men huddle around newspapers left behind in diners, tracing headlines about Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and warships moving like sharks through distant seas. For hobos, who've already spent a decade living on the edge of survival, the idea of another global conflict stirs a strange mix of dread and opportunity. Some scoff. "Ain't our problem." Others lean forward, eyes gleaming. War means work. You hear stories of World War I veterans on the road, still carrying their medals in tobacco tins or pinned to patched coats. They speak with gravelly voices about trench mud and gas masks, their words half warning, half invitation. Younger hobos listen intently, torn between fear of death and hunger for purpose. For men who've been treated as invisible, the army sounds like a chance to be seen again, to trade boxcars for barracks and rags for uniforms. Here's the historical anchor. As the Depression dragged on, the looming threat of World War II became a turning point. Many hobos enlisted when the draft came or volunteered for military service. The war effort promised steady meals, clothing, and a paycheck, luxuries they hadn't known in years. In fact, the mobilization for war is often credited with finally ending the Depression, pulling millions into factories and barracks. For hobos, it meant the road itself was beginning to fade into history. Now the quirky detail: even before America officially joined the war, some hobos joked about forming their own hobo army. Tall tales painted images of men storming beaches with bindles instead of rifles, cooking jungle stew in helmets, and carving the Hobo Code onto enemy walls. Absurd, yes, but the jokes hid a kernel of truth. Many saw war as simply another road, another gamble for survival. But scholars debate whether hobos were eager recruits or reluctant draftees. Some historians highlight patriotism, pointing to letters where men described service as a chance to restore honour after years of shame. Others argue necessity was the real recruiter. War offered food and shelter, and that was enough. The tension lingers. Were hobos fighting for flag and country, or simply for the chance to live with dignity again? One evening in a Chicago jungle, a man named Colorado Jim announces he's heading to the enlistment office. The camp grows quiet. Some clap his back, calling him brave. Others shake their heads, muttering about trading one kind of cage for another. Jim shrugs. Better a cage with meals than no cage at all. His words hang heavy in the smoke. When you lie awake later, staring at the stars, you can't shake the thought. The rails have carried you far, but how long can they carry you? War looms like a black horizon, promising both danger and deliverance. You don't know yet which path you'll take, but you feel the road shifting beneath your boots. The freedom you've clung to is being tugged toward a battlefield, and whether you like it or not, history is calling. The years roll forward, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the road begins to thin. Factories hum again. Fields hire steady hands. Men who once huddled by jungle fires now stand in line at employment offices, their patched coats replaced by work shirts fresh from warehouses. The rails are still there, but fewer hobos ride them. The Great Depression loosens its grip, and with it, the hobo nation begins to fade like steam dissolving into morning air. You notice it first in the emptiness of the jungles. A fire pit left cold, tin cans rusting in the weeds. The laughter and the music that once pulsed through the camps have quieted. Some men went to war, others found factory jobs, and some, too tired, too sick, too lost, never made it to see the recovery. The road, once crowded with wanderers, now feels lonelier, as though you're walking through the ghost of a world that only existed for a season. Here's the historical anchor. By the early 1940s, the hobo era was in decline. The mobilization for World War II pulled millions into military service or defense industry jobs. Economic recovery, driven by the war effort, meant fewer men were forced to wander in search of scraps. The culture of the hobo didn't vanish entirely. Conventions in Britt, Iowa, and oral traditions kept it alive, but its golden age as a mass phenomenon ended with the Depression. Now for the quirky side, even as hobos disappeared from the rails, they lingered in American folklore. Cartoon characters like Boxcar Willie or songs about the King of the Road romanticized them. Decades later, festivals would crown new hobo kings. Parades would celebrate their legends, and kids would dress as hobos for Halloween without ever knowing the hunger that shaped the original culture. In a strange twist, the very symbol of poverty became, in memory, a figure of nostalgia and charm. But scholars debate how to remember the hobo. Were they tragic victims of economic collapse, forced into a life no one would choose? Or were they pioneers of resilience, building a culture out of scraps and refusing to vanish? Some historians insist on the suffering, the cold nights, the hunger, the deaths on the rods. Others prefer to highlight the creativity, the humour, the brotherhood. The truth, you realise, is both. The hobo story is neither wholly tragic nor wholly romantic. It's the complicated middle, the grey space where survival lives. You take one last ride on a boxcar, leaning against the doorframe as the wind whips your face. The fields below are green again, farmers waving from tractors. Towns bustle with energy instead of fear. You feel both joy and melancholy. The world is healing, but the road that made you is disappearing. You were part of a brotherhood bound by hunger and motion, and now that brotherhood is dissolving into history books and tall tales. As the train slows into a station, you step off, boots crunching against gravel. For the first time in years, you're not sure where you'll go next, but you know the rails no longer own you. The journey that began with boxcars and broken dreams is ending, with something new, something steadier. The road has given you scars, stories, and a strange kind of pride. And though the jungles may fall silent, their fires will burn on in memory, crackling in every story told by those who lived without a dollar yet survived with something stronger: grit. So here we are, the rails quiet now, the jungle fires reduced to memory. You've walked the road from its raw beginnings, boxcars clattering through the night, chalk marks on fences, stew pots bubbling over smoky flames, all the way to its quiet fading, when work returned and the hobo nation dissolved back into the towns and cities they had once drifted past. It feels a little strange, doesn't it? To step off the tracks after so many miles, to loosen your bindle and realise the road itself has ended. But that's the thing about history. It doesn't vanish. It lingers in echoes. Every time someone sings a folk tune about the open road, every time a child dresses as a hobo for Halloween, without realising the hardship behind it, the memory flickers. The hobos were more than drifters. They were survivors, teachers, storytellers. They proved you could live without a single dollar if you had wit, grit, and the kindness of strangers. Not comfortably, not glamorously, but live nonetheless. And maybe that's the lesson to carry with you tonight. Life strips things away, jobs, homes, certainty. But even then, humans find ways to stitch community out of scraps, to laugh when laughter feels impossible, to share stew when there's barely enough for one. Hobos didn't just ride rails. They rode the thin line between despair and hope, and somehow kept their balance. So as you settle into your own bed, safe from bulls and bitter winters, think of those fires by the tracks, the guitars buzzing with songs of sorrow and defiance. Let the rhythm of the rails lull you, soft and steady, as though you're swaying in a boxcar under a sky stitched with stars. Sleep easy, knowing the journey's done for tonight. Tomorrow, new tracks will always be waiting.